It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeffry Gerber. He's a board-certified family physician and owner of the South Suburban Family Medicine Clinic in Littleton, Colorado. He's known as, quote, Denver's diet doctor, unquote. Jeff trained at Temple University School of Medicine in Philadelphia, completed his medical residency in family medicine at Abington Memorial Hospital. He sits for his family medicine recertification exam every 7 years and attends CME programs on a regular basis in that discipline. In 2010, Dr. Gerber received the honorary degree of Fellow from the American Academy of Family Physicians. He is also a member of the ASBP, AAFP, and the Colorado Academy of Family Physicians, the Colorado and Arapahoe Douglas Elbert Counties Medical Societies, and the Weston A. Price Foundation. He is focused on prevention and treatment programs using low-carb, high-fat, ancestral, paleo, and primal diets in the overweight and obese. He maintains a database of patients looking at weight loss and improved cardiometabolic markers, demonstrating the benefits of these types of diets. Let's give a warm ASBP welcome to Dr. Gerber.
Thank you, Scott. Can you hear me now? Yes. So I want to thank the Society for inviting me. It is truly an honor to be speaking in front of so many people, and I hope you have woken up. So today I'd like to talk about a non-traditional approach to nutrition, which clearly represents a paradigm shift in our thinking. We want to talk about better nutrition and the problem with dietary carbohydrates, but we also want to answer the question, why and how has nutrition significantly changed in the last 100 years? This change, unfortunately, has been detrimental to our health and also costly as we spend more money at the doctor's office treating the complications of obesity. So we're going to be looking for some answers, and we're going to turn to the science of nutrition and hopefully redefine healthy nutrition. So I don't have any disclosures that are pertinent to the content of this lecture today. The outline, we're going to talk about the history and politics of nutrition. We're going to get into the science of nutrition, look at the evidence, hopefully rewrite nutritional guidelines, and come up with a summary and an action plan. So a little terminology. We have this twin epidemic known as Diabesity, and it tells us that there's a relationship between the two conditions, that of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. And we describe that relationship as this spectrum of insulin resistance, and we'll talk about that. And just to realize that the chance of developing diabetes is more common than you might think. Some obesity statistics, there's many, but unfortunately, we are one of the fattest countries in the world, if not the fattest, and I think we have to blame our refined and processed foods that we eat. So out of these statistics, the one that catches my eye is looking at obesity trends over time, and this is the National Health Survey data, and you can see that prior to 1977 in adults, obesity rates are somewhere under 15%. And then, of course, in 1977, something happens. And I think we all know that it's the nutritional guidelines, but obesity rates start to skyrocket to the point now they've doubled in adults. They're up to a rate of 34%. And during the same time period, obesity rates have tripled in children and adolescents. And the concern is, if we don't do anything about this, in the next 20 years, by 2030, they're estimating that 44% of us will be obese. And in terms of diabetes, with an underestimated rate currently of 9%, 33% of us will be diabetic by 2050. And when you realize that 2/3 of our population are overweight and obese, it becomes a significant issue for most of us. So from a historical perspective, we have our little fat cat here, and we want to blame behavior for obesity and overweight, that we eat too much and we exercise too little, that we're gluttons and we're sloths. And in fact, the scientists, of course, describe this as the first law of thermodynamics, that it is a positive energy balance. And we obey the laws of physics, of course, but when it comes to metabolism, this is a very simple explanation, and there's much more to it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But, of course, the health insurance industry, they just buy into this behavioral disorder, and they're not going to pay for it because they only treat disease processes. And, you know, this is way back over the last 30, 40 years, and I consider that a huge mistake that this is the way the health insurance industry has been operating for the last 30 or 40 years. But it becomes the problem of the individual. They have to fix it. But this is the first principle of the first basic scientific principle. And the second principle is that of the lipid hypothesis that was made famous by a scientist, the name of Ancel Keys, in the 1950s. And that hypothesis goes that if you eat saturated fat in the diet, it will elevate cholesterol, and it'll lead to things such as atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke, you name it. Now, I won't go into the details, but unfortunately, the evidence to support this hypothesis was rather weak. And when I look at it, it's just another excuse to avoid caloric-dense fatty foods. But these two scientific principles become basically a popular trend. And not too soon after, we see the McGovern Select Committee report in 1977, and then shortly thereafter, the first USDA guidelines for America in 1980, and that's actually the cover of that pamphlet back in 1980, come up with these guidelines based on these scientific principles. And even in 1980, there was still objection to these ideas. In fact, it was Philip Handler, who at the time was the president of the National Academy of Sciences, who called this a vast nutritional experiment for which there was very little evidence. But guess what? Nobody wanted to listen. This was a mainstream idea at this point. And so these nutritional guidelines are now updated every 5 years. And in 1992, we have the little black pyramid in the middle, the food pyramid, and then it's updated in 2005, and it's updated again, and now it's my food plate in 2011. And it's the same old tired advice. Let's avoid saturated fat, caloric-dense foods. Let's replace it with polyunsaturated vegetable oils that we have some issues with in terms of inflammation. And yes, let's eat more carbohydrates as starches, and guess what, sugar, because the food industry discovered that if we take the fat out of the food, it's not going to be palatable, so we have to replace it with something, so they replace it with sugar. And it's just interesting to notice how these how these recommendations seem to follow the abundant supply of these carbohydrate-rich food commodities. So the argument here is that these guidelines are based on weak evidence that are providing us with the wrong tool. And basically, they're telling us if you want to be healthy and lose weight, you have to starve on a low-fat, low-calorie diet. And everybody knows how hard that is to do for a lifetime. So, as we've been getting fat over the last 30 to 40 years, the question is, have we been following these guidelines? And again, this is National Health Survey data that shows during this time period we have been following the guidelines. We have increased the amount of carbohydrate that we are consuming, unfortunately as refined and processed carbohydrate, including sugar, and we've decreased saturated fat intake while protein remains the same. Now people argue, well, this isn't the reason for obesity, we're eating more calories. And I agree, we are eating more calories. The problem is it's about 500 calories a day of carbohydrate. So since the work of Ancel Keys, we have looked at this lipid hypothesis. And the question remains, does saturated fat cause heart disease? Is there a causal relationship? And so my friend Larry Istriel, who is a medical student, who's writing his thesis on the topic of nutrition research, is actually here today, but he has a breakout session after me later this afternoon. I encourage you to attend. But basically, he has a wonderful summary of the scientific literature. And so over the last 60 years, we see that we have both observational studies, We have meta-analysis of the observational studies. We also have clinical trials and meta-analysis of the clinical trials. And when we look at these, the majority of these studies do not show the causal relationship. And that's about 3/4 of them. And the ones that do show a weak correlation or an association are problematic. The problems that we see are investigator bias, that they don't control for confounding variables, such as other lifestyle issues, smoking, drinking, exercise, the quality of the food. They sometimes don't even consider carbohydrate consumption. And so when we put this all together, we find it problematic, and we don't see that there's any causal relationship. Despite this information, unfortunately, most doctors still believe that there is this causal relationship. But I think our group is having a different opinion about that. So let's look at big farm agri. And the agriculture industry has gotten very good at mass producing food over the last 100 years. And they get it from the food commodities. And let's take a look. So we have the grain products as corn, wheat, rice, and potatoes, or potatoes also. And then we see all the sugars. And then soybean, again, is a commodity of choice. And then these industrial vegetable oils. So let's take a look. So we have issues with carbohydrates. So they're mostly carbohydrate or all carbohydrate. And then there's some issue with the proteins, such as wheat. So the food has now been changed over the last 30 years that the glutenin and the gliadin and the lectin have changed in such a way that they're addicting, they're inflammatory, so we have problems with that. There's also the idea of these anti-nutrients in wheat, for instance, the phytates that are all issues. And then we have starchy vegetables like potatoes. And then the sugars, and the point that I'd just like to make is the only difference between table sugar and high fructose corn syrup is really 5% fructose content. And you know, there's been a lot of attack on high fructose corn syrup, but in general, I think there's an issue with sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and carbohydrates in general. It's kind of, you're missing the message if you just eliminate sugared sweetened beverages from New York City, or the big ones. So then we have soybean. Again, we have soybean as this protein of choice. There's some concerns about the proteins there with the flavonoids. And then soybean oil and the other oils such as canola oil and corn oil. And again, we're eating those oils because they told us saturated with fat was bad. But now there's some issues about these polyunsaturated vegetable oils, that they're unstable, they oxidize, and they can very easily turn back into trans fats. So that's another issue. And then we have the whole foods, the animal and the plant-based products, which are less available, or either they're more expensive. We can see the farmers are incented. And so in particular, after World War II, we see the development of the Farm Bill. So initially, it might have been a good thing. But then it changes. In 1971, we see the concept of fence row to fence row farming, where these big farm agri companies are going to just plow down everything in sight, including small farming industry. And you know, it's basically food commodity for profit. And the argument is we have so much corn and grain today that we don't know what to do with it. During this time period, they learned to cross-germinate these to plants and to increase certain properties, increase yield. And then in the 1990s, we have the introduction of genetic modification of these plants. And now what they do is they, again, can genetically modify the plants to enhance certain properties, to make them resistant to pesticides and herbicides. And guess what? These companies are now making the pesticides and the herbicides that the plants are resistant to. And the question is that, number one, is that sustainable farming? Number two, what are the effects of our health? What are the effects on the environment? And we really have companies like Monsanto and DuPont to thank them, or not thank them, for having changed our food supply forever. So the food manufacturers, they're in the business of selling food for profit. And they can best do this by obtaining these raw materials, which are the food commodities, putting them in a package, sometimes putting a healthy food label on it, and making a lot of money. And they've gotten very good at making the food tasty and addicting. This unhealthy combination that we'll actually talk about, vegetable oil and sugar. And we want to eat food that tastes great. We don't want to eat food that's addicting, and this is the problem. I think the wheat and the cereal industry is a big issue with these what I call false health claims. And then we have food lobbyists that are funding politicians to support these programs. And in this big election year, you can be certain that no one's going to touch this. Bobby Brown said that. So you can be certain that the food industry is not interested in your health. They're only interested in selling food. So another way to look at this, how we ate before agriculture, which was about 10,000 years ago in the big scheme of evolution, not such a long time ago. But we started out as hunter-gatherers during the Paleolithic era, which spanned some 2.5 million years ago. And what we suspect they ate were whole foods. They didn't know how to process foods. And guess what? Whole foods tend to have less carbohydrate. And what they probably ate were animals and fish, and on a seasonal basis, as it was available, things like vegetables, fruits, nuts, roots. And then about 500,000 to 1 million years ago, they discovered the use of fire to cook their food, so cooking food easily releases these macronutrients, all these nutrients. And the idea is that these choices are what made us the dominant species. So how do we know all this? We know this when we look at bone fossils. We can look at radioisotope studies. And when we look at the fossils, we can see that the bones were thick, they were long. That suggests that we had a tall, muscular group. There wasn't any disease in the bone either. And so people say, well, caveman didn't live as long. Well, I guess we don't know that for sure, but when you eliminate things such as infant mortality, infection, and injury, it appears that primal man was indeed healthy. And so the argument is that all changed in a very short period of time, some 10,000 years ago. As we come out of the Stone Age and we settle and we learn to farm. And what do we farm are the grains, and we domesticate animals for dairy. And so at this point, they say there's a deterioration in health when you look at the Egyptian mummies. You can see that their bones were riddled with chronic disease. So I think we all have issues with the grains and the carbohydrates. The Paleolithic group do also express concerns with dairy, but even if you're paleo, they still consume butter. We all avoid milk because of the sugar content, and cheese, cream cheese, those kinds of other things, to me, are just really a source of natural fat. Of course, if you don't have any intolerance to proteins, the casein in the whey. But the point here about these ancestral diets is that we should be eating whole foods, clean foods, unprocessed foods. I don't think anybody can argue with that. And it is modern civilization that has really changed nutrition for better or worse. And the other point is that I don't think any of us would be here today were it not for corn, grain, and corn, wheat, and potato. But the argument now in the 21st century is that these are the foods that are making us sick. Hope that makes sense. So let's look at the cost of health care. Here we are again, another world leader, where we spend more on health care than anybody else in the world. And you can see that it's interesting, in 1977, 1980, the red line on the top represents the cost of health care in the US, and it starts to skyrocket. So of course we see nutritional guidelines come out around this time. We see high fructose corn syrup. We also see the deregulation of health care. And so now, presently, we spend almost twice per capita on health care expenditure compared to the rest of the world. So that actually equates to about $2.6 trillion. And guess what? We spend about 3/4 of that money treating chronic diseases like atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke, aging, arthritis, cancer, you name it. And here's the big problem. As we all know, Medicare and Medicaid said, whoa, we only pay for the treatment of diseases. You know, we don't pay for preventive programs. And how silly and backwards is that? I think that's why we're all obesity physicians, because we're progressive. We realize how broken healthcare is, and this is our kind of goal to fix this kind of thing. And so it's very reactive the way the healthcare system is currently organized. In fact, Mary Vernon, who's the ex-president of the society, I've heard her say, and I couldn't agree more, that it is it's a backward system in terms of incentive. So I get letters from the insurance company, Dr. Gerber, you've put your patient on the correct medications. You've ordered the correct expensive tests. You've sent them for the right procedures. So we like you. What we would like to see is them reward us as healthcare professionals for helping our patients lose weight, improve their health through these types of programs, and getting them off medication. It's all backwards, right? Right on. So perhaps it might be changing a little bit. We had a lecture earlier today talking about the changes introduced by the Preventive Services Task Force. And perhaps it's a step in the right direction. It might allow healthcare professionals that were traditionally afraid to discuss nutrition and weight issues. Now it allows them the ability to do this. But here's the problem that I have with it, and that is that the insurance industry is still considering obesity and overweight behavioral disorders, whereas the argument, it's really more of a chronic metabolic disease. And I think, I don't know that that will ever change, but I know for us, most of us are really thinking about it as a chronic metabolic disease. So, and we all know treating the complications are profitable, but again, our time and money is probably better spent addressing the cause, which is nutrition, overweight, and obesity. So, this is what we have become. It may have started out as evolution, but over the past 30 years, we have artificially manufactured nutrition to the point that we're now sick, we're overweight, and we have to go to the doctor's office and be treated with expensive medications and procedures. And I don't think nutritional guidelines are helping. They're actually hurting and causing this. And so I think it's clear the nutritional experiment has failed, and we need to do something about this. So this is where I like to say fat reform is healthcare reform. And it's very easy to say the things on the slide here, but the implementation, that's the hard part. So if we can address obesity, we're going to save trillions of dollars addressing complications. Those of us in the healthcare industry who are most interested in our patients' health need to be regulating the food industry. Right now, it's a very, they're self-policing, and that's just a dangerous practice. We want to redefine the delivery of healthcare itself, where nutrition, obesity, and overweight are center stage, and we're appropriately reimbursed by the insurance industry to address these conditions. We want to redefine healthy nutrition, and we'll talk about that in a second. I need some water. And we're going to talk about the perils of dietary carbohydrates and why fat in the diet isn't such a bad thing after all. So we're going to talk a little bit about food metabolism and the macronutrients. Thank you. And that all macronutrients are not created equal, specifically carbohydrates, that they are fattening and inflammatory, and fat and proteins are not. We're going to talk about obesity as a chronic metabolic disease, and we'll discuss insulin resistance and inflammation. So insulin. So insulin is one of several hormones. We think of it as the master hormone, and its primary role is to regulate energy and the storage of energy. Blood sugars, I think, have less and less to do with it beyond it. To be honest, it's really just a secondary effect. And we think of dietary carbohydrates, the simple fuel, as turning on that insulin switch. And the carbohydrate is nothing more, nothing less, just a pure form of energy. Now, dietary proteins and fats are different. And that is because we have to process proteins and fats for energy. So proteins through gluconeogenesis will provide us with energy, and that does have effect on insulin and blood sugar, but not nearly as much as carbohydrates do. And then fats through beta oxidation, and when you consume fat, it really does very little to your hormone levels and your levels of insulin. The other point is that fat and protein are essential. We can't live without it. We can live without carbohydrate because there's many other sources for fuel in our diet. And yet we've been consuming carbohydrates in abundance for the last 30 years. So the insulin receptors, they respond to the insulin signal. We see them on lean and fat cells as well. And basically that just triggers the cells to absorb the food energy in the blood. Our mitochondria can use that energy at will. If there's extra energy, especially carbohydrates, will be converted to converted to fat in the liver. We also see a small conversion to glycogen, and then the fat will be stored throughout the body. So as insulin rises in the normal state, we see a suppression of appetite. We call this a classic negative feedback pathway. Now, when insulin drops, the reverse happens, and that is really a signal to release energy from storage. And there's two conditions when that occurs. The first condition is in between meals or fasting, and the second condition is when we consume a meal that's very low in carbohydrate. And I think we would all agree it's basic physiology. So insulin resistance. As we overeat, we begin to store body fat. We have a greater body mass, and now we have to produce more insulin to keep up with the larger body mass. And just imagine years or a lifetime of overeating. We're storing that extra energy as body fat. We're producing more insulin. Eventually, the insulin receptors become overstimulated, and they become resistant to this insulin signal. So now we have to produce even more insulin to store the excess energy, and it creates further insulin resistance. And if it goes on for long enough, eventually the beta cells become strained, and they die out, and perhaps that's the point where we develop type 2 diabetes. But you can see that this is really a disease of insulin overload. A little bit of insulin is a good thing. A lot of it's a really bad thing, and again, caused by dietary carbohydrates. So insulin resistance also makes us hungry, and there's two ways to describe this. Number one, we have this gigantic body mass that's filled with adipose tissue, and we're now spending most of our time feeding our fat cells. So insulin and energy is going directly to fat cells, and so this may be one explanation for why people that are overweight are hungry and have no energy. The other idea is that we can see insulin resistance directly in the brain in both the hunger and reward centers, the hypothalamus and the nucleus accumbens. And the way to describe insulin resistance in the brain is you don't get the satiety signal. It's broken. So you eat, you're still hungry, so you just keep eating until the peripheral signals tell us that our stomach's swollen and bloated to the point that we already overate way too much. So there's other hormones that regulate food intake, and we can think of this as its own endocrine system where there's basically 5 organs. And the first one on the upper left is the adipose tissue, adipocytes. They release a lot of hormones, and we just had a whole lecture about leptin. Leptin is similar to insulin and insulin resistance, although it's somewhat different. But here it does regulate food energy. Leptin, as you just heard, does a lot of other things. Then we also have the pancreas that is releasing insulin, amylin, polypeptide P. We have the stomach releasing ghrelin, and the bariatric surgeons like to cut our stomachs out and take away our ghrelin. We have the large and small intestine, vagal afferents, where we see PYY, GLP-1, CCK, all these other hormones. And so they regulate food intake, and the problem is really signaling. And it's that signaling that not only makes us hungrier, it also causes inflammation throughout the body. It's that inflammation that is unhealthy to our mitochondria. And we don't want to have sick mitochondria. So, another way to look at this is that this is a disease of adiposity and inflammation. And I just want to say that I think we've seen this slide in different forms all week long. And so when you see the same information, I would draw two conclusions. Number one, either the speakers are crazy, or number two, we're on to something. But so the whole idea here is that we're dealing with a disease of adiposity and inflammation. And at the center, we have the fat cells that release these inflammatory substances. The majority of them have a negative effect, with the exception of adiponectin, which paradoxically decreases. That was one of your pre-test questions, by the way. And then secondarily, we see a release of free fatty acids, which is again directly inflammatory and oxidizing to the endothelial lining of blood cells. We see the release of insulin and IGF-1. And so when you look at this milieu of adipokines and cytokines, you can see that they are the cause of chronic diseases such as prediabetes, diabetes, atherosclerosis, heart attack, stroke, fertility issues, dementia, premature aging, liver, gut, all types of inflammation. And I always like to say, cancer is a big one. Are there any oncologists in the group? Anybody? Sometimes we usually have a couple of oncologists. There we go. I see two back there. So they'll tell you that they're really concerned about things like IGF-1, PAI-1, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and IL-6. And so what I like about this slide is it really describes obesity and overweight as a chronic metabolic disease. This has very little to do with behavior, if you ask me. So insulin resistance, the evaluation and the treatment. And I think the important thing to realize is that this is a spectrum illness. It begins with overweight and progresses to type 2 diabetes. Now, metabolic syndrome is just kind of a subset of prediabetes. I think carbohydrate-restricted diets have been around for a really long time. And, I thought when Syndrome X and this metabolic syndrome came to be that this was the bee's knees. This was going to be it. Mainstream was going to buy into carbohydrate-restricted diet. It hasn't quite happened. So we need to come up with more angles. But the other idea is that we want to try to stage this. And there's no consensus as to staging of insulin resistance at this point. Now, maybe people in the society, we can come up with staging. We've been talking about it on forums already. So we have research tools such as the glucose clamp. We have the HOMA-IR. We have the Quickie, where they're basically looking at ratio to glucose to insulin. Now people are looking at triglyceride to HDL ratio, triglyceride to insulin to C-peptide. So I guess the point is that since we don't have a consensus, you have to try to come up with something in your offices, in your practices, that you can do consistently. In the meantime, we can talk about it. I know people are trying to actually come up with a consensus as to staging of insulin resistance. It's important because it will help to guide us in terms of treatment options, both nutrition and medication. Of course, we want to do body measurements. We want to look at comorbidities. We want to look at genetic variation. For instance, the Far East Asian population, who tend to be very insulin sensitive, I don't see as much weight issue or prediabetes or insulin resistance in that particular population. And we can compare that to the Southern Asian, the Asian Indian population that get diabetes at the drop of a hat. They tend to be they get insulin resistant. They're very sensitive to carbohydrates. So those are things to consider. So we have these other markers, and just a little bit about cholesterol testing. So to understand that we're really treating inflammation, and we can use cholesterol testing, and it's important, but it is a marker of inflammation. And the argument goes back and forth. Is cholesterol a cause or an effect of inflammation? And I kind of focus on cholesterol as a marker of inflammation, not necessarily the cause, but that debate's going to go on. So insulin-resistant treatment, again here the food is the medicine, and we simply remove the optional fuel, which are the dietary carbohydrates. And this reverses everything we just talked about. We will turn off the insulin switch. We're now going to release stored energy. We're going to reduce inflammatory signals. We're going to control hunger and appetite. And if we can simply tell our patients to cut out corn, wheat, sugar, and the refined and processed foods that come from these food commodities, I think we'll be doing a world of good to our patients. Oops. So we have the other macronutrients. The dietary proteins are essential, and in a relative sense, we increase protein in the diet, but not to say this is a meat fest, by no means. Again, we have to consider that protein will affect blood sugars and insulin levels. In fact, we try to even work with vegetarians or lacto-ovo vegetarians to try to come up with healthier sources of protein and fat. So I particularly see a lot of Asian Indians in my population. I think maybe there's a lot of them that live in my area, but I play tennis with a lot of them, and they send family and friends over. So we have some experience with that. So dietary fat and cholesterol. So again, consuming cholesterol in the diet doesn't do a whole lot to your blood cholesterol. Now dietary fats, again, the big point is they're not inflammatory. If you eat a tablespoon of saturated fat, it really does very little to hormones and insulin levels. So it's not the atherogenic component. And the argument is we really got that wrong. They're essential, they're healthy, they're caloric dense, and they fill you up. And so the idea is that we want to provide dietary recommendations to patients that are caloric dense foods so they fill up rapidly and they're not going to want to eat as much, and that it's metabolically favorable. So there's one exception. I mentioned it before, where we eat carbs as sugar and fats as vegetable oils. It's doubly bad because the carbohydrate acts as an insulin catalyst. And this is what we see in the standard American diet. And this is perhaps why we have a problem with obesity and overweight. So there's medication. When you consider that insulin resistance is a chronic metabolic disease, we want to try to find smart hormonal drugs. And so I don't know that metformin is the smart hormonal drug, although it's been there for some time. It's leptin favorable, we just learned that. But some of these smart hormonal drugs, the GLP-1, exenatide, liraglutide, also amylin, I think of them as insulin sensitizers. And that's a very good thing. We have the traditional appetite suppressants. There's new drugs in the marketplace. There's some over-the-counter stuff as well. Again, to realize that we treat comorbidities with nutrition. Nutrition's center stage. We can use medication. Modern medicine's a wonderful thing. It does keep us alive, but we have to first start with the right nutritional guidelines. And then there's gastric bypass surgery, and I would just say that we have to cautiously select patients for this procedure, at least to try a carbohydrate-restricted diet. So this is what we tell our patients, to eat real foods, unprocessed foods, because they tend to have less carbohydrates. We give them tools such as glycemic index, glycemic load, counting grams as carbohydrate, and so we want to avoid these high glycemic foods that come from, again, corn, wheat, potato, sugar, those kinds of things. We want to eat low glycemic foods, so these are animal-based foods that tend to be unprocessed, unrefined, low glycemic vegetables, occasionally some fruit, but you have to be careful. Again, dairy, low glycemic dairy, and nuts. We want people to eat what we refer to as healthy natural fats, and they include the saturated animal fats. Coconut oil and lauric acid is a medium-chain fatty acid that may be an excellent choice of fat for ketogenic diets. Yes, the monounsaturates, such as olive oil and avocado, and really the only polyunsaturated that I recommend is fish oil. So again, we want to avoid the inflammatory polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Again, they told us to eat those because these natural fats were unhealthy, but what you have to understand is that prior to 1912, when obesity wasn't such a big issue, we cooked with butter and lard. And then that was shortly replaced with Crisco oil, trans fats. So that took us in the wrong path, took us down the wrong path, excuse me. So we call these diets low-carb, high-fat diets, ketogenic diets, whatever you want to call it, and also ancestral diets. And the benefit is that they control appetite, they promote weight loss, they enhance fat burning during exercise. And I don't know if you guys have read The Art and Science of Low-Carb Performance, Low-Carb Living by Jeff Volek or Stephen Finney, but that really spells it out rather nicely when you exercise, how you want to become a fat burner when you exercise rather than a carb burner. And the emphasis is not on calories per se, it's more on the macronutrient content and the quality of the food. So we can compare diets head to head, and so on the one extreme we have the very low-fat, high-carb diet, which is a calorie-restricted diet. And our argument that any diets work, especially these low-fat ones, because we're restricting all the macronutrients, including the restriction of carbohydrate. But the problem is it's just hard to do that long term. And then on the other extreme, we have the very low-carb, high-fat diets. I think, well, of course, Atkins diet, the Bernstein diet. And the point, and we're serious when we talk about high fat. So it can be 10% carbohydrate, but the fat content can be sometimes 60, 70, 80% of calories or energy from fat. And that's, number one, it's scary to patients because we're so used to the low-fat mantra, and it's also really challenging to do. But the other point is that these low-carb diets are nothing new. I think Dr. Atkins had just made it popular, but they really go back to the 1860s when William Banting wrote his letter on corpulence. And before the 1950s, if you went to the doctor, I mean, I wasn't even born then, but so I hear that they would tell you to cut out potatoes and bread if you wanted to lose weight. So the other point is, again, about food quality. I don't care if you're doing a vegan diet or a Mediterranean diet or low-carb ancestral diets. Everyone insists that you have to keep it real. Real food, clean food, unprocessed food. Where we disagree, of course, is the macronutrient content, and we have some big disagreements. But the low-carb, high-fat, and ancestral diets, the high-fat diets are truly very high fat, whereas the Paleolithic diets, it's less fat, more protein, more carbohydrate. So what diets are healthy and safe? And I'm happy to say that over the last 10 to 15 years, we have dozens of relatively well-done RCT trials comparing low-carb to high-fat diets. In fact, just in the last 2 months, we have 2 meta-analyses. One I was just released this week. I was reading on the airplane right out here. And what all of these studies are showing is that on a low-carb, high-fat diet, we have greater weight loss, and more importantly, a significant improvement in the metabolic markers, such as lipids and then blood sugar. So the ADA reluctantly has approved low-carb, high-fat diets back in 2008, although it's a very weak recommendation because it goes against everything that they've told us for the last 30 to 40 years. But it's there. So so let's look at one of these. So this one you see all the time. I apologize. It's only here because it's probably one of the best randomized trials. This is done by Chris Gardner out of Stanford, the A to Z weight loss study, where he randomized 300 women into 4 diet zone, Learn, Ornish, and Atkins. And what's statistically significant is the Atkins, which is the diamonds on the bottom, and the Ornish, which is the squares up above. And so basically you can see at 6 and 12 months there's a greater weight loss. Now this is interesting because it turns out that the average calorie consumed on all these diets ended up being about 1,800 calories a day. And yet you can see the metabolic advantage of the low-carb, high-fat diet. The other interesting point is we had Chris Gardner, the author himself. We had an opportunity to meet with him when he spoke to the society in Denver in April. And first of all, the guy's just absolutely brilliant. He would be my lead investigator if I did feeding trials, which he points out how hard it is to do feeding trials. I mean, to just cage human beings for a period of time, that's why you can only do it for 6 to 12 months. But we need to do it longer. But he has investigator bias, and that is that he's a vegetarian for ethical reasons, and yet he's scrupulous. This is what he sticks to. This is what the data, what the data show. So what he showed us in April is that he actually took it one step further. He broke down his cohort into the group on the bottom that were insulin resistant. He defined that as a fasting insulin over 10. And the insulin sensitive with an insulin less than 7. And what the discovery is that patients that are more insulin resistant lose more weight on a low-carb, high-fat diet. Intuitively, that makes sense. That's actually exactly what we see in our clinical practice, but he demonstrated it. So on low-fat, if you're insulin sensitive, you lose weight on both diets. But this is what we see again clinically, and this kind of guides my treatment. Although this was women, what we find, and everybody knows, men seem to lose weight much more rapidly than women. And we still focus on low-carb, high-fat diets on both, but perhaps in this group that's more insulin sensitive, maybe we have to bring other things into it, like food quantity. And that's something that I think about when we try to measure insulin resistance. I talked about that. So thank you, Chris Gardner, for that. And he's very much interested in staging insulin resistance and coming up with a clinical tool. So metabolic markers, okay, almost done. Metabolic markers, this is lipid profile. And on the Atkins diet, basically all the numbers improve, especially triglycerides go up, HDL goes way down. On the Ornish diet on the left, all the numbers go down, perhaps unfavorable. And then we've criticized Atkins because sometimes we see a bump in LDL. And so we'll just jump ahead. Rather than show you the data, we've now looked at what happens to lipid profile on low-carb diets. And we now look at the advanced testing, and we see particle size improve away from small dense LDL to the fluffy LDL pattern. We also see an improvement, triglycerides drop, HDL rise, which may be a better indicator of inflammatory potential, oxidative potential, insulin resistance potential. And there's other markers, ApoB LDL, which I think is a more advanced way to look at LDL. But again, this is actually my profile. For May, and it's very typical, and I can't go through it. This is Berkeley Heart Lab, which I particularly like because it's got the red, yellow, green. And basically, all the metabolic markers improve. My LDL was much higher when I was 40 pounds heavier. There, I think it's 140, but ApoB is kind of in the middle range. But the idea, we have patients that have clean carotid arteries on IMTs, all the metabolic markers, CRPs, hemoglobin A1Cs, everything's normal with the exception of ApoB or LDL. So does that mean it's a bad thing? This is where the argument is today. So we have patients, I apologize, I can never get through this. That's how it always works, but Marcia went on a strict paleo diet. David Mendoza, he has a website, he's devoted his career to writing about his diabetes. He's a great story. He had been a diabetic for 10 years, and then we met each other at the time that exenditide came out in 2005. And we basically put him on exenditide and a low-carb, high-fat diet, and in 2 years, he lost 49%, half his body weight. So that's just wonderful. He started out with a glycemic index diet, then he went to low-carb diet, and he's not on any medication now. You know, the last lecturer said you got to keep them on medicine. Well, it depends. So Pat's story was he lost 40 pounds. How easy it was to lose weight by eating a low-carb diet. Eric has a profile similar to me. However, he did have some other risks, and we actually did recommend statin to him. So sometimes there's a role. So there's so many sources out there. I think Gary Taubes replaced the late, great Dr. Atkins, but there's so many resources out there, and some of the resources are sitting in this room today. I mean, this is just a great society. You can read peer-reviewed journals, but unfortunately there's bias in the peer review to the old nutritional guidelines. So you really have to read it with an eye of caution. Well, anything that you read for that matter. So we're trying to redefine nutrition in the next century and beyond. And again, low-carb, high-fat diets, ancestral diets, keeping it clean. We want new federal guidelines. That's going to be a tough one. We want the healthcare industry to regulate the food industry. Again, we want nutrition center stage in the delivery of healthcare, and ultimately this will control the cost of healthcare. So good food is good medicine. Number one, we are a wonderful society that we have really embraced the opportunity to look at nutrition and diet and these disease processes in a whole different way. I think social media is kind of a neat thing. I'm a little bit addicted to it, but you can share your message with others out there. I think we need to do a lot of research. We still need to look at outcome studies. We need to redo all the outcome studies looking at atherosclerosis, heart attack, and stroke. Dr. Richard Feynman from the Nutrition and Metabolism Society describes it. We have to generate a null hypothesis based on insulin metabolism and macronutrients and either prove or disprove that null hypothesis. So that's all I have. I have more information. I just updated I have a brand new website and blog. It's lots of fun. But thank you very much for your time. It's listed at the bottom.
Oh, great job, Jeff. Oh, outstanding.